This is an ABC podcast.
We've been riding this Omicron wave for a few months now, with case numbers and hospitalisations reaching all-time pandemic peaks. There are hints that that wave might be cresting now, though the daily death toll is still very sobering. And unlike previous outbreaks, when people had to stay at home, quite a few people are now locking themselves down by choice. It's been called a shadow lockdown, and it's having some significant impacts economically and in other ways. We'll find out some of the reasons why soon. This is Life Matters. Recent mobility surveys are showing something very interesting under Omicron. Many people are staying home, on the East Coast in particular. Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne CBDs all showed movement far below pre-COVID levels over the summer break. And that's even though we're technically free to move about. I really would love to know from you, are you keeping yourself in this so-called shadow lockdown? I want to hear what's behind that choice and when you might feel safe to come out. Is it about your particular family situation or household that's vulnerable? Is it about a broader sense of unease about what might be going on there? Or about something else that we might not have thought about? I'd love to hear your reasoning, your thinking behind staying inside when you technically can go out. When you might feel safe to come out too, that's a key one. What might influence your decision making there? Dr. Sanjaya Senanayake is Associate Professor of Medicine and an infectious diseases physician at ANU Medical School. Dr. Senanayake, welcome.
Good morning. How are you?
Good to have you back on the program. And also with us today is Dr. Lilian Nijad. She's a clinical psychologist and author based in Melbourne. Dr. Nijad, welcome to you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Great to have you both with us. It's really good to have the perspective of the psychologist and the infectious diseases expert, I think, because this is a combination of different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of drivers operating in people's minds. Sanjaya, research from the University of Melbourne shows that major East Coast CBDs saw a big drop in movement over summer, not down to lockdown levels, but vastly lower than pre-pandemic. Are these kinds of self-imposed lockdowns necessary right now, even though the health advice says, yes, you can move about?
Yes, look, and just to put this, I guess, a bigger perspective, when I was asked to do this last week, I've since reflected and realised that I'm probably doing the same thing to some extent, because I'm just thinking of myself, I'm a healthcare worker, and I keep thinking if I get COVID, then it means one of my other colleagues will have to work for me, and they may or may not be in a position to do that. So I'm being very careful from that point of view, and I do have a vulnerable person at home, a parent who's much older. So a couple of reasons I think we as a family are being quite careful. Even though we are venturing out, we are being very cautious about how we do it. In terms of should we be doing it now, going back to your original question, look, Omicron is a very infectious agent. There's some data from a Japanese researcher which said it's probably about 4.2 times more infectious than Delta in its early stages. And considering how infectious Delta is, it pretty much changed Australia from a zero COVID policy to accepting life with COVID. That's pretty frightening, really. And we have seen so many, literally millions of cases of Omicron in a very short period of time. So I think, yes, if it is worth being cautious, does it necessarily mean you should lock yourself inside and never venture outdoors? No, but it does mean you should be cautious. You should think about, do I need to do this? If I need to do this, how do I minimise the risk of getting COVID?
Well, and where do you draw the line? Because one person's cautious might be another person's, unbearable isolation.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think you've hit it on the head, and we've got Lilian here to talk us through those aspects as well, because you're quite right. Being alone in lockdown, or self-imposed or otherwise, can lead to enormous mental health problems, anxiety, depression, a cognitive decline because of those reasons as well, particularly in older people. So yes, it is very hard, and I guess the information isn't always out there in the media or on the internet about whether I should venture out or not.
Yes. Well, just quickly, Sanjaya, before I go to Lillian, the research showed that people's movements were linked to case numbers. Is that a good thing to base your decision-making on, particularly at the moment?
Yeah, well, you're quite right. Probably, me personally, I'm looking at hospitalisation numbers because those case numbers we hear from the chief health officers in the states and territories are likely to be highly inaccurate because there's a lot of Omicron out there that's being missed, and that's because the PCR testing just isn't up to dealing with so many cases. There's lots of asymptomatic Omicron out there, and even with the rapid antigen test reporting, a lot of people are still being missed.
We're speaking with Dr. Sanjaya Senanayake, Associate Professor of Medicine and Infectious Diseases Physician at ANU Medical School, and Dr. Lillian Nejad, who's a clinical psychologist. But we'd love to hear from you too, because if you have chosen to stay at home or just stay at home a bit more than you usually would over glorious summer weather, what's behind that? And how's it affecting you? Because it is a big decision for some people to continue after perhaps a year or 2 years of government-imposed sanctions, mandates to stay home, to keep doing that yourself. Lillian, what's your sense of how people are feeling right now about their safety in public places?
Well, look, I do think that there is understandably some anxiety still, and of course frustration. They're likely to be at the top of the list of emotions at the moment. And that's completely understandable and normal. And, anxiety does show up to help protect us and keep us safe. So not only is it understandable as a response, but it's also functional because it actually motivates us to take the helpful actions that we've been taking over the last 2 years. I think anxiety, frustration, and people are feeling frustrated, of course, because this has been going on for 2 years now. And it has been, we've had our ups and downs. We have had that sense of freedom for several months at a time, and then it can be taken away, and that's extremely frustrating and can actually cause a lot of challenges and problems for people. And
we'll talk in a few moments about some of the strategies for coping with that sense of isolation too, and I guess the fear and worries about how much hope we have in the future. That's a thing that's on a lot of people's minds at the moment. But I wanted to ask you, Lillian, because Brisbane is a bit different from Melbourne and Sydney. When you look at the data, they've got relatively high case numbers for Queensland, but they're at a much higher percentage of mobility than the other states. So they're up around 77% compared to around 50 or 60% for Melbourne and Sydney. Does that suggest that people's level of fear and the decisions they're making might be partly based on how badly they've been hit by COVID in the past, not just, the news generally from around the country?
Oh, look, I think that definitely is going to have an impact. It also probably because, especially people in Victoria, but also in New South Wales and Sydney, we're actually conditioned to behave in a certain way when we hear the cases rising. So we're used to it. So, the cases have risen beyond what we could have ever imagined. And so it makes sense that people would impose lockdown on themselves, given the current numbers, because that's what they're used to doing when the numbers rise.
So it's like a normalisation process. You get used to that being the reaction that's appropriate to rising case numbers.
That's right.
Dr. Lillian Nejad, you're listening to. She's a clinical psychologist, but I'd be very keen to hear your thoughts too about your particular motivations if you're making some changes to the levels of movement and public activity that you might ordinarily expect to see in yourself and your family and your loved ones over your typical summer. If it's a bit different, if you're limiting things, I'd be really interested to hear from you to explain your particular situation and the trigger that might make you say, yep, it's safe to come out now. I am fine. Sanjaya, it's going to be really different for some people, isn't it? You talked yourself about having a vulnerable family member at home. Is it smart for at-risk people and groups to be lying low right now?
Look, I think so, yes. So if we look at people who are immunocompromised, they've got low immune systems, but to be honest, within that group, it's quite a big group. There are some who are a lot more immunocompromised than others. But we know the vaccinations do work, but the response isn't as good, which is why we've recommended more vaccinations as a primary primary strategy in immunocompromised people. They're people you wouldn't necessarily want to get COVID. I mean, from their point of view, they can get very sick. From a societal point of view, they tend to excrete the virus for longer, and that can lead to variants rising. So and of course, older people as well who've got a number of chronic health conditions, heart issues, lung issues, etc. You want to minimise your chance of getting COVID, but at the same time, you have to be pragmatic. You have to be able to balance that health risk with your mental health and your needs. You need food, you need groceries, you need to meet someone for financial reasons or whatever. So what it means, if you do venture out, to make sure you are well prepared. And of course, the best way to be prepared is to have received the appropriate number of vaccinations. If you're going out, make sure you've got a mask on. A cloth or surgical mask is fine, but we've been hearing a discussion about these N95 masks in the US. The Biden government is releasing 400 million N95 masks for free into the community. So for those particular people at risk of COVID, those N95 masks might be better. Using QR codes just to know if you have been exposed to COVID, because if you are at risk, within the first 5 days of you getting COVID, you're eligible for an antibody infusion called sotrovimab, which reduces your risk of hospitalisation. So they're sort of strategies you can use.
So at-risk groups are eligible for that infusion, and you talk to your GP about that?
Yeah, talk to your GP or your local health department. So, people, look, typically it's for unvaccinated or not fully vaccinated people, but in people with low immune systems, even if they've had the full lot of vaccines, they'd be considered for it.
We're getting some calls on this topic now with people who've chosen to limit their movement, stay inside a bit more. Kerry's in Tasmania. Kerry, welcome.
Hello.
Hi. Now, tell us what you're doing and not doing at the moment that's a bit different from your past life, I guess.
Well, we're sort of in self-imposed lockdown because we can't get the booster. We live in northwest Tasmania, and my husband has, we're both around the 70 mark, and my husband has lung and heart problems. And I keep hearing that everybody should go and get a booster, but we've had a 6-week wait, and we've got another 2 weeks to go. So we're still in self-imposed lockdown.
And Kerry, what's that like?
We're retired, and we live in a really beautiful part of Tasmania. So it's not a problem. We go to town once a week, but that's all we do. And it's actually very relaxing and nice.
So you don't feel the lack of social contact?
No, not with, use the phone, social media, emails, messenger, everything. No, I feel quite connected.
And it sounds like it's really worth it for the peace of mind anyway.
Well, the reason I rang is that I keep hearing that, we should go out and get booster shots. Well, that's all very well, but some of us can't get them.
Yeah, good point. Kerry, thanks for your call.
Bye.
Bye. Helen's in Bondi, a very different part of the world to isolated Tasmania. Helen, welcome to you.
Hi.
What's your reason for going into self-imposed lockdown?
Can't get hold of our AT tests. We've been trying since the middle of December, and it's almost embarrassing to go into a pharmacy to ask because the staff, understandably, are so harried. They get asked that question so much that they reach the end of their tether. So we just don't bother asking. The
pharmacies near where I live just put signs up out the front, no rats today, and they're always there. But yeah. Helen, how's that making you feel about your chance of being able to come out of self-imposed lockdown at some point?
Well, I have been out and about occasionally, but every time I go out and register, the message comes back from New South Wales Health that I've been in contact with somebody in the same place that I've been. So it just makes me want to stay home more. And
so you mentioned that you'd had the booster, and does that give you a measure of comfort?
Oh, yes, I feel confident in having the booster. Just very angry that we can't get hold of the RAT test.
Good point, Helen. Thank you. Sanjaya Senanayake, it's interesting because I thought that having boosters would make people feel a bit more bulletproof, but I'm getting the impression from the data that that's not necessarily the case. What's your view?
Yeah, so certainly we know Omicron has challenged the current vaccines that we have in Australia far more than Delta has. And 2 doses in terms of getting COVID, just symptomatic COVID with Omicron, 2 doses of vaccines, you've got very low protection after about 6 months from that second dose. You still have reasonable protection against hospitalisation, which is about 50%, which is good. Certainly a booster does make a difference, particularly in the first couple of weeks. It does drop off after 10 weeks in terms of symptomatic infection. It's still very good for protecting you against hospitalisation. So if you've had a booster, your protection against hospitalisation with Omicron is really good. But it really has challenged us, and that's why Pfizer and Moderna have started producing that directly addresses Omicron, and they've started human trials, and they're hoping probably in terms of it getting into our arms, it'll be about December when that happens.
Sanjay, we're just having a few little fuzzy moments with your line. I'm just going to tell our listeners about some of the texts that are coming in because people have some really interesting views on this. Lauren in Canberra says, my dad has elective surgery tomorrow, so we both cut mingling and social activities until the surgery is safely done, and I'm also working at home. And our Facebook page, actually, ABC Radio National, has shown a lot of people saying, I don't want to get it before I go on this big holiday, or there's a particular birthday I want to make sure I'm up for, or health events like Lauren's father, and people really isolating ahead of those. Someone else says, I'll come out when it's safe, not to keep the coffee shops going, which is an interesting one because there is a lot of pain in the retail sector now when we had hoped that moment was over. Someone else says, we will stay in until hospital numbers go down, and this is only fair for the poor, hardworking health staff. Dr. Lillian Najad, it's really interesting seeing those comments on our Facebook page saying we're doing it to keep others safe. Debbie says, absolutely. You know, I love my frail but vaccinated 84-year-old mother, and due to what she calls the let it rip policies, I refuse to attend pubs, clubs, coffee shops, hairdressers, beauticians, restaurants, big chain stores, shopping centres until further notice. How big a factor do you think that is in people who are choosing to stay at home in their decision making?
Well, look, I think what we're hearing from everyone so far is that they're making decisions that make sense for their circumstances. And it's based on a variety of reasons, including availability of boosters and rat tests, and also based on the seriousness of the issue in the area that they live, but also among the elderly or immunocompromised people, or potentially people who are pregnant as well, and also people who have medical conditions or getting ready to go to the hospital. And I do think that Australians are really caring, that they don't want their healthcare workers to be overwhelmed, and they don't want their hospitals to be overwhelmed. So they're staying home for those reasons as well. And then, of course, we're also maybe prioritizing, important events, not only for ourselves so we can attend, but also to keep other people safe as well.
And then, Lillian, there's also people who are still choosing to move around freely. What do you think is some of the factors that might make people say, look, it's important to me to get out and about, I need this? Where is that difference in thinking coming from?
Well, look, I think we're probably seeing younger people more likely and willing to venture out. They probably see themselves, and they are, at less risk. And people who aren't, sick or have chronic health issues are probably more likely to venture out as well. So, look, I think it just depends on people's individual circumstances and their kind of willingness or to risk it, and also maybe their sense of, if they get it, how risky will it actually be for them and their health. Yeah,
it often feels like trying to make decisions in a vacuum sometimes because you've heard different kinds of health advice. Do you think that people are staying home, Lillian, perhaps because they are not sure what the best thing is to do, and so they're taking the most cautious path?
I think maybe some people are just trying to be as cautious as possible in this current environment. And that makes sense because, yes, like you said, we're receiving different news sometimes, it seems, every day. But I think most of us are pretty aware and saying fairly abreast of what's going on, what the numbers are, booster rates, hospital rates. And so I think most of us are basing our decision on the data that we're receiving and on our own particular circumstances.
We're taking your calls today on Life Matters here on Radio National. Are you choosing to stay at home more than you usually would on, a normal summer, if anyone can remember what one of those is like, and perhaps more than even just before Omicron hit? What's behind that decision? What's driving you to do that? And when do you feel like you might feel safe enough to come out of that shadow lockdown it's being called? Rachel's called in from Preston in Melbourne. Rachel, you've got kids and you've made some decisions around their movements.
Absolutely. Hi, Hilary.
Hi.
We have 3 children, 2 of whom were not vaccinated and couldn't get vaccinated until, I think, 10th of the earliest they could be vaccinated was the 10th of January. And we were really fortunate to get them vaccinated before school started, but we really wanted to keep them away from people before they'd got a vaccination, just to ensure that they didn't get sick and therefore couldn't not get that vaccination in time.
Yes.
For school starting. So that was one reason for us. We also have a 14-year-old, and he's off to a term-long camp, which starts on the 6th of February. And if he doesn't get off to that camp and start like it would be for a Year 7 starting school or an O week, this is a unique experience where he's going with students that he doesn't know. It would be really disappointing for him to miss out on that first week should he get sick. So our younger 2 have gone off to school today, which is amazing, and we've kept our older son home from school from the first week that he could go to his standard school, so that he's not getting infected from school. But I'm actually going to take him away tomorrow so that he's not linking up with our younger kids who are now out in the community and potentially connecting with COVID.
Wow. So you're going to have to split the family for a while.
Just for a little while. And we're really fortunate that we're in a position to do that we can, afford to take the time and find accommodation, whereas a lot of people couldn't take that option. So we're doing it for ourselves. That sounds selfish. We're making all those decisions. But the other primary reason that we've stopped a lot over the holidays is just I didn't want to get it and accidentally pass it on before I knew that we'd had it to any other family, having known what people have gone through, particularly we know what young families have gone through during this period. And I just would have hated to pass it on. So I was kind of cautious about that as well.
Well, then, Rachel, do you have access to enough rapid antigen tests? Because often before the significant event, you want to know that you're not going to be passing it on there, and sometimes there's a requirement that your child or you get tested before you turn up at X, Y, or Z thing. Is that a concern for you as well?
It is, until we were fortunate that we were able to pick up some rapid antigen tests for the school students. Yeah, on Sunday our school opened and allowed us to collect them. So they were able to go off knowing we knew that they weren't infectious going off to school. And we also will know when our oldest goes off to the program that he won't be taking anything with him. But that's only just because we've got those tests Sunday.
Exactly.
So before then, no, we didn't have tests.
I know. I remember in the start part of the January holidays, I was away and I said to people who wanted to come to visit, look, we'll do rats before you come. You do rats before you come. Everyone will be safe. It'll be great. By the end of it, it was like, no one's got any rats. We're going camping. Stuff it. Yes. We need this. It's really interesting to see the change in our thinking. Rachel, all the best for the camp and for the family. Thanks for calling in.
Thanks very much. Cheers, Hilary.
Fascinating insights into these particular situations that are coming up now that we never could have predicted before COVID and before Omicron in particular. Arnold in Latrobe in Tasmania. Now, Arnold, you're in the older age bracket, you and your wife. How are you feeling about going out these days?
Well, we're rather cautious. My wife is very cautious about going out, and I go out with the shopping list and do the shopping because I'm stupid enough to put a mask on and I'm all right going around the supermarket. But that's something that's necessary, and if we don't, we die of starvation or we have to get some stranger coming visiting to deliver things. So I don't worry about that because there's not a lot of tourists and visitors around the area, but there are some, I'm sure. And the thing that upsets me a bit is the fact that there was a group of us, about 12 men, that left over from a Probus club that had to close because of lack of membership. And I agreed to keep on the contact, and we have lunch once a month at the local pub, and as a social gathering. But up until last December, we were quite happy doing that. And then they opened the borders, and the numbers of infected people wandering around went from 2 on the first day, and very rapidly it doubled every 3 days. Before long, we're up to 2,000 people in Tasmania, and it was spreading very fast. So I had to cancel the January lunch, and we're not sure when we're going to have another one.
And just to clarify for people listening, Arnold, you're in your 80s, and that group that you mentioned that has lunch once a month is between 70 and 90. So that is a vulnerable group, isn't it?
Yes, we certainly are. And, even before the COVID virus, our group was diminishing each year. We were losing when I joined it about 5 years ago, there were 30 members, and we were losing members at the rate of at least 1 or 2 a year. Now we're down to only losing 1 a year, I think, and it's rather macabre if you think of running a sweep on who's next. But we're all a bit concerned and about going out somewhere where visitors are likely to turn up, and it's become a sad sort of situation.
Yeah, well, and as you say, Arnold, you and your wife are double vaxxed and had your boosters, which is a great thing. But I've crossed my fingers for you that you can start having your lunches in a sense of safety again. Thank you for calling in.
Okay, bye.
This is Life Matters on Radio National, and we're taking your calls today on whether or not you feel safe to go out and about. Even though the law says you can, most places have very few restrictions on our mobility and even gatherings. But a lot of people, the data shows, research from Melbourne University and mobility data from big tech platforms are showing that a lot of people are staying home. Particularly, they've focused this research on the East Coast CBDs, big drops in activity compared to pre-COVID levels, not as low as the lockdown levels, but still a big dip, and that's having impacts on us as well as on businesses. So today we're speaking with Dr. Sanjaya Senanayake, who's Associate Professor of Medicine and Infectious Diseases physician at the ANU Medical School, and Dr. Lillian Najad, a clinical psychologist. Ivan is a bit of an outlier in McLeod in Victoria. Ivan, really good to speak to you. Tell us how you're feeling about going out.
Look, it doesn't bother me in the least. I've had my 3rd jab. I go where I go. It doesn't bother me. If I go into a retail setting, I wear a mask, just out of precaution, out of politeness. I don't need to in most aspects, but that's just the way it is. I stay at home and I listen to your program amongst others and learn a lot.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that, Ivan. It's interesting, though, because I know other people who've been triple vaxxed and wear their mask, but they're also aware that Omicron is a pretty tricky virus and it can get around those things from time to time. Do you feel like it's just worth going out and doing those normal and necessary activities, or is more that do you feel a bit fatalistic about it?
It doesn't bother me in the least.
So you think you probably won't get it, or you might get it, but you're willing to take the risk?
I won't get it.
Ah, okay. That's optimistic. Well, Ivan, I'd love to hear from you if things change. Do let us know if that doesn't continue, but all the best for you. Thanks for calling in.
Thanks, Louise.
I won't get it, says Ivan. That's a really interesting thing to say. Dr. Sanjaya Senanayake, what about this attitude that some people have that's the opposite of Ivan's, that we're all going to get it eventually? How does that sit with you as a doctor? I mean, it is starting to feel a bit inevitable at times.
Yes, look, I think Omicron has really challenged us, and that view has been circulating ever since Omicron came about because it is so infectious. But even though we've had millions of cases in Australia in these last few weeks, not everyone has got it. And my advice to people is, look, yes, we all might get it, but that's not a reason to go out and deliberately seek it, because you do hear about these attitudes, I guess, completely opposite to what we're talking about, where people are actually going out and hoping to get on, so they just get over it, it's done, and that's it. But of course, getting COVID has its consequences. I mean, particularly if you're young, healthy and fully vaccinated, the chances are you'll be fine. But there's also a tiny chance you might not be. So I think I still think we have to practice a degree of caution. And yes, we're all vaccinated, but there's a lot of COVID about. We should just, if we have to move about, we move about, but we just use common sense measures, those COVID-safe measures we've been talking about for so long now.
And Dr. Lillian Najad, do you think the choices people are making are consistent and rational about this kind of thing? I mean, I notice myself I'm wary of big public events, but I went to the movies the other day because I felt like I needed a treat. Do you think we're being intelligent about this?
You know what? Everyone has their own kind of level of risk averseness, and also the things that they want to prioritize and that are important to them. So it's really about creating that balance of, you know, social connection and isolation for your health and safety. And that's not going to be the same for everyone. We're all in the same, we're kind of, you know, we always hear this, we're all going through this together, but we're not all in the same boat. And so we're going to be making decisions based on our own particular circumstances and priorities.
Now, interestingly, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say I can relate to what you said, because for me, I was keeping myself isolated until the Australian Open, which is a giant event, but it's very important to me. So I wanted to go, and I, of course, took all the precautions necessary to get there. But yeah, I put myself in a position where I was around a lot of people for several days.
And it was interesting to see apparently that the data in Melbourne, where you're based, showed a rise in mobility around the Australian Open and the warm weather and the public holiday. So it'll be interesting to see what a couple of weeks' time's case numbers and hospitalisations look like. Interesting too, Lillian, that you say that people are making decisions based on their own situation, because we are seeing quite a strong theme on our Facebook page of people saying, I'm doing it for broader reasons. I don't like to assume that I might get it now when the health system is so overstretched. Linda says, I figure I'm privileged enough to be able to limit my trips outside home, so it's the least I can do to support those who can't for whatever reason. So I think, how big a factor do you think that altruism is?
Absolutely. I think that our values definitely come into it, and people are basing their decisions on their circumstances, but also on their values. And a lot of people, like I said before, are very caring and considerate of the healthcare workers and how much pressure that they've been under for the last 2 years. And that's great that, you know, people are making decisions based on that as well.
I'd love to hear more about the decision making. Let's take some more calls here on Life Matters. Kirsten's in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. And Kirsten, you're a small business operator. How are things for you at the moment?
Things are, hi Hilary, things are, they're a little bit of not a little bit of a struggle. After 2 years of struggling, I think that shadow, people staying home, is starting to really affect us now. However, I heard that person that was on Facebook before, you said that they're not going out because they're not going to save the cafes. That's absolutely fair enough, because people's jobs are not to go out and support businesses right now necessarily. All of the funding is now gone. We're out there on our own after 2 years of really struggling with rents and that kind of thing, not to mention however many years before building up the businesses. But it's that thing now, it's like, well, people aren't on the street, they're not spending, and yet we have no support. So it's kind of like, wow, we thought it was tough before, but now it's getting really scary, and it isn't. You don't want to entice people out with your goods, you don't. But you don't have a choice but to be open and trading, and it's this real struggle every day to just sort of think, okay, well now. The words pivot and all those sorts of things, we've kind of lost all of our energy, and now we don't have financial support. And it's like, what are we doing it for anymore? And we want to keep going, but it just looks bad now.
And as you say, Kirsten, it must be a real tension thinking, well, I'm a punter as well and I want to stay safe from this virus, but I'm also a business owner.
Yeah, it's a real struggle, considering that, we had to police the mandates in the shop and that type of thing, and that was really emotionally and mentally draining, and we were for it and we were happy to do it because we just want our communities to be safe. But it just got to that point where it's like, I want to go out and I want you to come to my shop, but I know that it is safer. We always shut early. We always stayed shut. We had a really good landlord, and it was something that we could do for the community. And now we can't do that anymore, and we have to. And we are pretty adamant with people complying with masks and sanitising in the shops. But it's just. Without that financial support now, there's just no confidence to go on, and there's only so long kind landlords can be kind. And it's really sad after 2 years of struggling to now think, this is what's going to get us. And yeah, it's hard for the business community, I think, but anyway, we just have to keep going until we can't anymore, I guess. So,
and it is an election year, so you never know what the messaging might be.
It is, Hillary.
Yeah. Lobby hard, Kirsten, lobby hard.
Oh, no worries.
Look, thanks for your call. All the best.
No worries. Bye.
Off to the Central Coast of New South Wales now. Ruth is on the line. Ruth, welcome to you. How are things at the moment?
Oh, they're fine, and I am out and about a little bit. I've gone back to our painting group. We meet inside, so there are different events I do go to, but less than usual. But I was saying one thing I do use a lot is on Google Maps, if you're going to, say, one of the food shops or the hardware shop or anywhere like that, if you click on the actual little thing that's on the map that's for that business, on the left-hand panel you get a whole lot of information, and one of them is how active, how alive that store is at the moment. They show the average in blue, like a little bar graph, but then in pink, moving, they show live how busy it is. And so I often have a look and think, I've got to go to such and such, but I'll have a look and see how busy they are. And I choose a time when they're not quite busy, and it does work out because I might see a shopping centre itself is very busy, but the one shop I want to go to is very quiet. And I've found that I've gone there to just that shop, and there's been a basketball court between me and the next person.
Excellent.
And yet in the store down the road, which was the food store, it was very busy, so I didn't go into that shop. So it's quite handy to choose a time, and sometimes I'll go in the evening to get stuff anyway, but in the daytime, if I have to go out, I have a quick look at the map and say, how busy is that store? And I think, it's a good time to go now, I'll go.
Using technology to help you. Ruth, that's great. Thank you for that strategy. A lovely text on that too from Tony. My wife is immunocompromised, so we're not going out very much. He says, I was doing the weekly shopping at a supermarket between 7 and 8 a.m. on a Sunday, but I recently changed to 6 a.m. It's wonderful. No avoiding other trolleys in the aisles or queuing at the checkout. Lovely. Well, and on that, Dr. Lillian Najad, what are some strategies that people might use to cope if they are feeling worried about re-entering the world? Because I guess it's about that sense of control, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a sense of health and safety and control, and in trying to create a balance that's healthy. I think one of the best things and most helpful things you can do is validate yourself and don't judge yourself for feeling anxious or frustrated or distressed, because they are all very understandable emotions to be feeling right now. And then to be able to distinguish between, what's functional anxiety that's, helping us and is protective in a helpful way versus dysfunctional, which is when it's very severe or overly intense or having a significant and negative impact on the important areas of your life, or leading to feelings of hopelessness and despair. And that's when you really need to address it.
And Lillian, with a self-imposed lockdown where no one says, okay, this is the end date, it's safe to come out now, do you think it might be challenging for people to work out when it is okay for them to come out?
I think it's very challenging. I think that the rules change from day to day. We hear different news, different emphasis about the news every day. So I think it is quite challenging. I think it's helpful. That's why I think it's very helpful to stay connected and talk to people, kind of get a sense outside of your own situation about what other people are doing. I think we've heard some really clever ways of dealing with our current circumstances just from the callers today, about how to still get out there at the same time as taking care of yourself and making sure that you're, lessening your risk to be infected. So, I think it definitely challenging, but there are ways that you can work on getting the best information you can and keeping yourself healthy and safety, but also mentally healthy.
Yes, indeed. Let's take a couple more quick calls before we finish up here on Life Matters today. Chris is in Taree in New South Wales. Now, Chris, you're retired and not going out very much. What do you think is going to sway your decision-making about when it is safe to come out?
I think when the booster numbers go up and then there's some results to see what the percentage of that then means for everybody and how that's allowing us to move forward with less risk.
So that'll give you that sense of safety?
Yeah, because I live in a very diverse area with education, socio-economic, and there's different opinions up here and different ways that people are managing it, and some aren't even interested in wearing their masks. So you're facing a lot of people with varying opinions and ideas of how to manage it, and that puts vulnerable people at risk.
Yeah, so you're facing the stress of wondering whether what you're doing is safe, but also dealing with other people's interactions as well.
Yeah, you can't, I'm not going to impose myself upon others, but when you're walking in, I'm only now going out to get my shopping, or if there's something that has to happen, go out a second time. For instance, I had to go to the vet. But even then, when you go out, even if you're wearing your mask and trying to do the social distancing, there's other people that are not that interested or for whatever reason, and so you do feel at risk. And I'm not unlike one of your other callers where I've gone out to simply get my grocery shopping and, once you get your QR code, you get the notification that you've been, that the shoppers at least had contact. And that's happened every time that I've been out for the last 4 weeks now. So you start to even go, well, every time you just go to do your basic shopping, you're being put at risk.
Yeah, a lot of tricky decisions. Chris, thanks for your call.
Thank you.
And very quickly, finally, from Frank in Shoal Bay. Now, Frank, it's not as if you've been going out and partying wildly every day for the last couple of years anyway, is it? But how are things at the moment?
Well, I don't circulate because I don't believe that the number of people being reported as having infection anywhere near the real numbers, because I don't know anybody that I know that's able to get the RATS kits. And you've only got to look at the rate of infection in aged care facilities. Is now more than 50% of all aged care facilities have got the virus raging through it because they don't have proper supplies of rats and testing and all that sort of thing. And I wouldn't believe the figures have been put out, because how can you know whether you've got it when you can't get a test? And as I say, I live in a community where I'm 92-year-old, and I live in a community where the vast majority of people who live in Shoal Bay, Nelson Bay, are retirees, older people. And I'm buggered if I know where you can get a test up here. I've tried most of the chemists and nobody's got them.
It's a situation everywhere, Frank. When do you think you will feel safer? Is it merely the availability of the testing and seeing the booster rates go up?
Well, yeah. When the number of tests go back to what they were, like we used to report 35,000 and 40,000, they closed down all their clinics and rely on people having rat test, and most people have got no bloody chance of getting the rat kit in the fit.
I know, you've got a rats, haven't you? It's a difficult situation for a lot of people. Frank, thanks so much for your call. Good to hear from you. Dr. Sanjaya Senanayake, case numbers have been easing, but as we're hearing from Frank as well as the news, many cases could be invisible and school is going back. When will it be safe for most people to move freely again? What indicators would reassure you?
Yes, and look, I think it has been interesting with our very first caller and our last caller. So two things which I think are objective measures which would make people more secure about moving out are a higher level of a boosted population. But we heard our first caller say in Tasmania, despite her best intentions, they've had to wait 6 weeks for a booster. It actually surprises me that it's taking that long. And of course, we've had a number of calls, including the last caller talking about the rapid antigen tests and the dearth of supply of those. And I think that makes a difference. So it really is important for those in authority to sort of focus on fixing those issues as quickly as possible. In terms of when we can go back, I really think, as some other callers have said, hospitalisation numbers will be the key. I do think we've reached the peak in most states and territories of this Omicron outbreak. But of course, reaching the peak doesn't mean that today's the peak and tomorrow it's 0 cases. We're going to see a gradual decline, which means for healthcare workers and the community, the next few weeks will still mean a lot of Omicron. If you look at where they peaked a couple of weeks ago, they're still reporting about 3,000 cases a day, which just prior to Omicron, they were having about 300 cases a day. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying that we would want hospital numbers to come down. We'd like to see a more boosted population and have rapid antigen tests out there. And I think all that would give us more confidence about moving about, but not necessarily lift restrictions like mask wearing, QR codes, etc.
Yep, it's that balance. Thank you both so much for joining us on Life Matters today and taking our calls with our listeners.
Of course.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Dr. Lillian Najad's a clinical psychologist, and Dr. Sanjaya Senanayake, Associate Professor of Medicine and an infectious diseases physician at the ANU Medical School. I just want to finish up with a quick couple of texts. One says, I'm a teenager. I want to keep my grandparents safe, but the health officials are saying that everyone's going to get it. So if I'm going to get it, I want to get it having fun rather than going grocery shopping. And Jen in Bondi says, following testing positive for COVID with rats, I've just come out of 7 days isolation as per the New South Wales health instructions, but I'm not confident to leave home or mix with family and friends. I don't want to be responsible for passing it on. My sister has planned for a family reunion dinner next week, but I'm reluctant to attend. It's the mixed messages which are confusing and make us anxious and stressful. You're not alone there, Jen. This is Life Matters on Radio National.
The bell has rung on the new year and 2022 is already changing our lives. Hi, I'm Patricia Carvelis and this week I'll be bringing you RN Breakfast with the news that changes your world, the people that change your mind, opening the door to new ideas. RN Breakfast, it's everything you need to start your day. Join me each weekday from 6 a.m. on ABC RN and the ABC Listen app. RN, think bigger.
When it comes to your true confessions, often it's these tiny moments in childhood that got you writing and then recording for us here at Life Matters. And that certainly applies to this confession from Beck Cos, which she's titled The Tale of the Plasticine Rabbit.
That day, the day before the Easter holidays in primary school, was one filled with joy. So far, we had scrubbed the ingrained dirt out of 25 tiny lime green chairs, years of coloured crayon, football oval dirt and other innumerable substances vanished with the quick flick of our king-size scrubbing brushes. We had also coloured in photocopies of Jesus on the cross, Jesus being resurrected, and in other poses. I remember colouring Jesus' face black and the teacher had put a big cross on it and written, "Messy." I've always wondered how come she knew that Jesus wasn't black. Then came the big highlight of the day. We were allowed to use the plasticine. This was a great opportunity for us youngsters, where the imagination could run riot. The plasticine bucket wasn't very attractive, however. It contained rejects from the animal world, some squished together. and little colour mixing experiments which made for lovely khaki, muddy and swamp colours of plasticine. Today we were told that we had to make Easter rabbits, and all my hopes of creating a lovely mud-coloured pony were dashed. Anyway, we started on our rabbits, moulding the rock-hard plasticine in our little warm hands to make it soft and pliable, leaving greasy masks on our desks where we'd rolled the plasticine, to make snakes, of course. Finally, we'd all finished, and there was an assortment of odd little bunnies, some looking more like hippos, other intricately designed, including a basket with miniature coloured eggs in it. We were then instructed to put them on a shelf outside the classroom and left table by table to put our finished rabbits together. I was on the last table, and by the time I got outside, there wasn't much space left for my rabbit. As I was setting my rabbit down in between a grey one with a little basket of eggs and a blob with a head, I was bumped by two boys having a play fight. The side of my hand crashed into the little grey bunny, and immediately, as if it had been hit by a semi-trailer, it was compressed. My heart shuddered inside my chest, and I looked at the mash of grey, blue, pink and brown that was once a rabbit. Quickly, I dashed back to class and sat cross-legged on the floor with the other kids. Soon my teacher came with us. She was a horse of a lady with big tombstone, false teeth and peroxided hair and bright glossy red lipstick. Her teeth loomed over us as she spoke. At that moment, Freya walked in, chewing one of her little black plats, crying. "Somebody's wrecked my bunny," she said in a nasally voice. She looked a little pale and her green eyes and freckles stood out immensely. She was one of Mrs. Hill's favourites. I wasn't. "OK, sit down, Freya. Don't cry. We need Mrs. Hills." Then the interrogation started. "Right, children, who accidentally, and I hope it was an accident, squashed Freya's rabbit?" I sat clammy-handed on the floor, toying with the idea of owning up, fiddling with my shoelaces and my tiny school shoes and trying not to blush. Mrs. Hill's horsey face leered at each one of us, and her teeth and glossy mouth glinted angrily. "Well, it must have been one of you. Who was it?" I saw all of my friends in class looking around and nattering amongst themselves about who could be the rabbit murderer. I couldn't own up now, it was too late. Besides, Freya was such a sook. On school camp she cried because she couldn't have milk before bed, and she bragged about her calisthenics all the time. My mind was set. It was just an old plasticine rabbit anyway. I looked at Mrs. Hill's ugly plastic high heels and squished my toes inside my school shoes to stop me from shaking, praying for the bell to go. I squished my toes even more until they hurt. The bell finally went. "We'll continue this saga after the holidays," Mrs. Hill said. But I knew, or hoped, that she wouldn't. She would have forgotten by then. Travelling home on the bus, I was very quiet. I held my colourings, my waxed and dyed Easter egg carefully, and I looked at my own plasticine bunny. It made me feel guilty, so I squashed it until it was just a spiral of colours. Poor Freya and our rabbits. I decided to make my squashed rabbit into a mud-coloured pony when I got home.
And that story was produced by Michael Mackenzie. This year, for your Life in 500 Words contributions, we want to hear about your thoughts on a new theme, precious objects. If you've got something that's precious to you, I'd love to know why. Maybe there's a story behind it, or it's had some big influence in your life. Make that tale about 500 words, record it into your smartphone and email it to us, lifematters@abc.net.au with 500 words in the subject line. And there are more instructions at the bottom of our homepage. That's it for Life Matters today. But next time, investing. It used to seem like something only for the well-heeled. But these days, there are a lot of options for getting involved. And almost all of us have a form of investment through our super anyway. But ethical investing can sometimes seem like a bit of a unicorn. Is it compatible with decent returns? That's if you can even define what ethical investing is. We'll talk next time on Life Matters to a young investor who's made some unusual decisions about where she puts her money and backs them up with some interesting arguments. Life Matters on Radio National with me, Hilary Harper. I'll catch you then.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.